to Moments to Midnight. We are one of several small groups from the Riverside Chapel Seventh-day Adventist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Small groups were formed under the leadership of our then senior pastor, Herman F. Horton II, so that Riverside, Nashville could become a Christian community where a person can love and be loved, know and be known, serve and be served, and celebrate and be celebrated. We hope you enjoyed this presentation and that your spiritual life is enriched by the discussion.
Father, thank you for this opportunity that you have allowed us to have on this blessed Sabbath day. Thank you, Lord, for being with us. We ask you now to open up our minds and our hearts as we continue our study. Be with our leader. Speak through him, Lord, and open up our minds and our hearts to receive the word. This we ask in Jesus' name.
Amen. Let's jump right in. We are studying the prophecies of Daniel, the prophetic kings of Daniel, to be more specific. And we are taking a trek through the eyes of the pioneers. We are walking in their footsteps as we are studying the Sabbath School Quarterly of the first quarter of the year 1904. Because they were living literally in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So they were very serious about studying Daniel and the Revelation at that time. So what I want to do right quick is to review the last lesson very quickly. I hope and trust that you all are studying these lessons before we have our presentation and doing your best to answer the questions and writing out the answers on either the quarterly or in your notes at home. But just in case you have not answered the questions for yourselves, we're just going to do a rundown of the questions. All right, back in the first lesson, Deuteronomy 29:29. We focused on secret things. That was the key word in that verse. And we highlighted 3 definitions of the word secret, or I should say the word belong, actually. And we chose to be suitable or appropriate, to be the property of, and to form an attribute or part of. And we looked at those 3 definitions and expanded the meaning of the word belong, as it shed even more light on God's intent when he tells us things, when he chooses to reveal certain things to us. There's intent and there is expectation behind the revealing of those things, because he expects and endeavors for them to have specific effects on us and our spiritual relationship to him. So he's just not revealing those things just from a point of knowledge. It's much deeper than that. All right, first question. What things does this text say belong unto God? And the answer would be secret things. He has secrets that he chooses not to share with people. And then he has things that he wants us to know. So the next question would be, to whom do those things belong which have been revealed? And we made a distinction between God's people in the Old Testament, God's people in the New. In the Old Testament, that would be the ethnic Jews, kingdom of Israel. In the New Testament, we're talking about spiritual Jews, meaning those Jews grafted into the vine, Gentiles, anybody who received the gospel of Jesus Christ in New Testament ages were automatically grafted in, and they received the same privileges and benefits that the Jews did in the Old Testament. That's where we get the phrase spiritual Jews from, covering believers, true believers in the New Testament. What is a revelation? Merriam-Webster's says simply, making known that which was not known. When we look at the Greek, it highlights that even further. In Greek, the word means making naked an element of truth. That matters. We're talking full disclosure here. He wants it to be revealed, and he wants you to know the truth. All right, question 2. Amos 3:7. Through whom does the Lord here promise to reveal his secrets? To his prophets, servants, his servants, the prophets. So the prophets exist to serve God's people. He has designated certain people that he tells things to, and then it is their duty and their obligation, their job, to then transmit that information to the rest of God's people. This is God's system of communication. And he intends to continue that even in this age. Joel tells us that there will be more prophets, men and women, young people.
Sun sets at 7:30.
Okay, that's fine.
And they will also communicate special messages to his people. The prophetic gift has not disappeared, even though we did highlight the fact that it was on pause in the intertestamental period. Those 400 or so years in between the Old Testament and New Testament, it appeared as though God had gone dark and was not speaking to his people. And that led to the Jews engaging in some seriously bad behavior and bad habits, which God spoke about when Jesus showed up. All right. Question 3. Through whom does the Lord say he has spoken? The prophets. Has he given more than one vision? Yes. He gives multiple visions to multiple prophets throughout the history of earth. What has he made use of in thus giving light through the prophets? He used the word similitudes. Similitudes are otherwise known as symbols. This word means more often devised thoughts that are used in comparison to the primary thing or thought. So he chooses to use one thing to shed light on another thing. And that first thing is the thing he really wants us to know. A classic example of that are the parables that Jesus the prophet spoke to his disciples. Those parables were full of illustrations and symbology. He used the same technique throughout other prophets all throughout the Bible. So God is consistent with the manner in which he communicates and the techniques that he uses during his communication. Because God says, I don't change. He is utterly consistent. Question 4, what prophetic book in the Old Testament deals most largely with symbols? The obvious answer, Daniel. And in the New Testament, the obvious answer, Revelation, which is why those two books are like bookends. They belong together. One unlocks the other one, and the other one unlocks the one. You can't properly study Daniel without Revelation, and you can't study Revelation properly without Daniel. They have to go together. Question 5, by what symbol was the future revealed? An image, otherwise known as an idol. 6, describe the experience of the king in seeking an interpretation of his dream. He was extremely troubled. He couldn't sleep. That dream bothered him. It was supposed to bother him. God wanted him to be troubled on purpose. Another meaning of that word is also disturbed, which is the same word we find in Genesis 41:8 with Pharaoh when he couldn't interpret his dream, and his wise men couldn't do it either. And then in Psalm 77:4, David's experience, he uses the word that is translated as troubled to talk about how unsettled he was, otherwise known as disturbed, that he couldn't even speak. So we see a very strong reaction by King Nebuchadnezzar from having this dream that he not only couldn't understand, but he couldn't even remember it. The only thing he could remember is that he actually had one. What confession was wrung from the wise men? They had to admit at the very end that they needed supernatural help. They couldn't help the king at all, and they couldn't do it themselves. Even after the carrot and the hammer were given to them by the king to persuade them to explain the dream and to tell him what the dream was, and even after he thought they were stalling for time, even after he thought they were betraying him on purpose, after all of that, the wise men had to admit, we can't do this. We need help beyond ourselves. Question 7, were there any in Babylon who had knowledge of God, of a God able to make known his ways in human flesh? Absolutely. Daniel. They were about to be executed. And Daniel had enough faith and trust in God that he said, wait a minute, I know somebody. Give me a minute, give me some time. I will confer and I'll get back with you. So he and his friends prayed, and Daniel was honored by God with answers. Then Daniel came back and said, give me an audience with the king. I have something for him. And then he delivered the dream and the answers to him. Question 8, what bold request did Daniel make of the chief captain, and with what result? He asked to see the king. And he was rewarded with an audience. And at that time, he delivered the answers that God had given him. Question 9, what was the dream? He saw an image, an idol, head of gold, silver chest and arms, brass torso, iron legs and thighs, brass thighs, and iron legs, and then feet of clay and iron, and then a stone that was not formed by human hands. That's important. That struck the base of the image and destroyed the entire image, turned it into chaff, and it blew away with the wind, and then the stone became a mountain that filled the planet. 10, what kingdom was symbolized by the head of gold? Babylon. 11, what metal represents the second one? Silver. And what was said of that power? That kingdom would be inferior or of less esteem in God's eyes. What power followed Babylon? Medo-Persia. And we talked about the way God looks at things in contrast to the way human beings look at things. When we were doing the two-horned beast last summer, we noticed that as each kingdom was conquered by the succeeding kingdom, the territory grew. So from a human standpoint, it would look like the kingdoms were getting bigger and better and more magnificent. Well, in God's eyes, they weren't, because human beings judge or rank nations based on territory, military might, wealth, magnitude of the GDP or GNP, or the power of its political influence among the world's governments. That's how people rank nations. God, on the other hand, ranks nations based on spiritual fitness, spiritual apostasy. How far away, how polluted do you become? And in his estimation, as the nations progressed, the empires passed, they got worse and worse and worse until the one in which Jesus showed up. He chose the darkest period to show up, consistent with the way God looks at kingdoms, and is illustrated by the diminishing value of the metals chosen to build the statue in the dream.
We have a question.
Yes.
So based on what you said about the fitness of the nations, Is there a nation right now on this planet that would fit that desired God's approval?
If we're being extremely rigorous, I would say not one. Because every nation has been polluted with the wine of Babylon, including America. Now, America does stand out only because, from a republicanism standpoint and a Protestantism standpoint, when we're talking about those two horns, this nation was the most favorable for God to raise up a group of people that would uncover the doctrines that had been buried during the Dark Ages. So in that respect, the United States gets a leg up. But when we really look at it from a spiritual fitness standpoint, every nation on the earth, every nation on the planet stinks. They're all polluted. They've all drunk the wine. There's paganism and spiritual darkness all over the place. And God's people in every nation have to contend with the advances and the errors and the lies of the devil, having polluted the population. So that would be my take on it. Question 12. What did the brazen portion represent? A third kingdom that would be a world empire, based on Daniel 2:39. Next question, what kingdom followed Media and Persia? Greece did. Question 13, what metal represented the kingdom symbolized by the legs and the feet? And that would be iron, based on Daniel 2:40-42. Give the prophet's description of this kingdom. The prophet Daniel described this as a strong kingdom that would eventually become broken and divided. And based on the mixture of clay and iron in the feet, it would be partially strong because it has some iron, but partially weak because it's got some clay. What power answers to the symbol? Pagan Rome. Question 14. Yes, question 14. I think let me see. Yes, question 14. Will these smaller kingdoms that have arisen out of the fourth monarchy of Rome ever be joined as one again? And the Bible is very clear on that. Absolutely not. Question 15. What will be the next step? The very next step in the prophecy from pagan Rome is papal Rome, producing the little horn that speaks great things, is blasphemous, makes war with the saints, and is an unusual kingdom in that it differs in quality from all the others that have preceded it. And then we talked about how sure is the prophecy? Is there any doubt about it? No, there is not. The word translated as certain means true and reliable, and the word translated as sure means trustworthy and to confirm. That means in the same way that the previous prophecies have been fulfilled, and we can confirm that by history, the prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled will absolutely be fulfilled. And we can trust the truth of it and make decisions based on that information. 2 Peter tells us to the answer of how sure is prophecy declared to be, more reliable than eyewitness testimony and personal experience. And we talked last week about how fallible eyewitness testimony is. It cannot even be trusted in a court of law to get justice. Too many people have been unjustly incarcerated and convicted of crimes they did not commit based primarily on eyewitness testimony. It is unreliable, and the system knows it. Let's question 16. First sentence of Daniel 2:28. For whose benefit was this prophecy given? With God, he's always trying to get the most good out of everything he does. So the benefit of that dream and that prophecy was not just for Nebuchadnezzar, not just for Daniel, not just for the Israelites, not just for the Babylonians. It was for us today. So he had a global scope in mind. I mean, a futuristic scope in mind, not just for present day people, but for people coming in the future. Because God's eyesight is long. He has a telescopic view of things and a microscopic view of things. He sees everything instantly all at once. All right, let's move into the second lesson. When did Daniel have the vision recorded in this chapter? Can anybody give that answer? Daniel 7:1.
The first year of Belshazzar's reign.
What year would that be? Does anybody know that? What year?
Is it BC 538?
That would be the end of his reign, the third year. What was the first year?
550 BC.
No. Anybody else?
541 BC.
Correct, because if 538 is the third year, then if we count up, because remember, this is BC. If we count up from 538 plus 3, that's how we get to 541. He co-reigned with his father, Nabonidus.
Sure did.
He co-reigned with his father, Nabonidus, in the last 3 years of the Babylonian Empire. Ptolemy's canon puts that at 538 BC, the last year, because that's the year when Cyrus the Persian took over, which is not inconsistent with Daniel 5:30 when it says Darius the Mede took over. That's why we call that empire the Medo-Persian Empire, because they co-reigned together. Cyrus allowed his uncle Darius to reign simultaneously with him. So that's why it's the Medes and the Persians, otherwise known as the Medo-Persian Empire. All right, someone read note 1, please. Anyone read note 1 in the quarterly?
Okay, I think I can read it. What happened to you?
Note 1.
Belshazzar reigned co-jointly with his father Nabonidus during the last 3 years of the Babylonian Empire. And it was at the close of his 3 years reign when, as the sacred historian records, quote, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, close quote, Daniel 5:30 and 31. This being true and that kingdom coming to its end in BC 538, it follows that this vision must have been about BC 541.
Notice that in Daniel 5, it mentions the Chaldeans. The reason it mentions the Chaldeans is because if you remember in Genesis, when it talked about Abraham settling in Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldees were Semites, which is short for Shemites, one of Noah's 3 sons. They were descendants of Shem, and when they migrated and settled in the lower region or the lower tip of the Mesopotamian Valley, which is in between the two great rivers in that area, Euphrates and Tigris. So when the Assyrian Empire, which predated the Babylonian Empire, came down and conquered that territory, they would conquer the Chaldees, or the Chaldeans rather. And then as their empire grew, they would try to rise up and get out from under that oppression. And then the Babylonians, which were south of the Assyrians, would capture the Chaldeans. So they went back and forth between the Babylonians and the Assyrians until around 671 BC. By that time, the Assyrian Empire had gotten so large that they had trouble keeping peace within their empire. So while they were occupied with revolts spreading around, the Chaldeans thought they saw an opportunity. So they got themselves together militarily and they went north up the coast of the rivers and entered into Babylon and captured that city. And it was there that something interesting happened. They got a clue and decided, let's change our tack a bit. So they actually persuaded the Babylonians to join forces with them. And they said, hey, if we work together, we can go further north, attack Nineveh, and we can strike at the Assyrians while they're occupied in other parts of their empire. That strategy actually worked. And that was the beginning of the end of the Assyrian Empire. So you had the Chaldeans and the Babylonians joining forces together, which is why you often have the Chaldeans being referred to in the same light as the Babylonians. But once King Nebuchadnezzar took the throne, when he took over the capital of the Assyrian Empire, knocked them off the board, and then came down into the Holy Land and took Jerusalem, he actually went and overwhelmed the Chaldeans. And then it just became the Babylonian Empire. They got knocked off the board. That's just a little history to back all that up. All right, question 2. What 2 symbols are used in this verse? Daniel 7:1, what 2 symbols?
And by the way, the lesson is here on the screen. I guess you can see it if you're on the screen share.
Okay.
Winds and sea.
There you go, winds and sea.
What'd you say?
Winds and sea.
Winds and sea. All right. In prophecy, what do winds symbolize?
Strife,
War.
war,
War or strife. Both of those words are good. In Daniel 7, Daniel used the word strove, and that word means to break forth. So we're talking sudden and with force and overwhelming power. So this is how war broke out, and this is how nations were conquered, and this is how empires were built. They were built through conquest. Remember that principle.
MJ, for our wider audience, can we look up those verses?
Daniel 7:1. Oh, look up Isaiah 21. Okay, yes. Someone take Isaiah 21, 1 and 2, and someone else take Jeremiah 25.
Isaiah 21, 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
The burden of the desert of the sea, as whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it cometh from the desert, from a terrible land. A grievous vision is declared unto me. The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously, and the spoiler spoileth. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all the sighing thereof have I made to cease.
Okay, so you can clearly see several words that lead you to think war, spoil, besiege. The word grievous means hard, cruel, rigorous in battle. That's another connection to war. Also look at the word burden. When prophets use the word burden, they're essentially telling you, I have a tough message from God to give you. It's a message you're not going to like. Remember in Matthew when Jesus talked about, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that does what to the prophets?
Killeth.
Killeth." Because it was so unpopular to be a prophet, because prophets were routinely giving tough, hard, unpopular messages to the people. That's why the word burden. If we look at the first verse of chapters 13 in Isaiah, chapters 15 in Isaiah, and chapters 17 in Isaiah, you're going to see burden, burden, burden. And then goes right into a prophecy about war and destruction. So you clearly see the wind war connection, and then you understand why the word burden was used when prophets use that word. Somebody read Jeremiah 25.
Thus,
32. Go ahead.
thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, evil shall go forth from nation to nation, with a great whirlwind shall be raised up from the coasts of the earth, and the slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth, even unto the other end of the earth. They shall not be lamented, neither gathered nor buried. They shall be dung upon the ground.
Wow.
That's a real strong connection between wind, war, God destroying his enemies, the slain scattered across the surface of the earth. And I have to pause right here. As much as we focus on God's love and God's mercy, we need to never disconnect him from his justice.
That's right.
And his right to destroy. He has every right to kill.
Yes, sir.
So when he rose up on his enemies, he's not messing around. He's taking people out. He is destroying people. People will die at his hand. And he can do that. He is justified. So we need to always remember, as merciful and as loving as God is, he's also extremely just. And when he decides it's time to destroy, he's going to destroy. Real, honest to goodness death. And he is allowed. He is justified. He has that right and that privilege. All right. Question 4. What are symbolized by the sea or waters?
They represent people.
Say it again.
Peoples, nations, and tongues.
Absolutely. Revelation 17:15. That's a classic text that we always use to show that connection. So when the Bible uses a symbol, somewhere in scripture, the Bible will decode it and tell you what that symbol means. Otherwise, what's the point of a symbol if we can't translate it? Because God is trying to reveal things to us. He wants us to understand what he tells us. Peoples or nations. Additional text here will back that same thing up. Jeremiah 51:42, Isaiah 17, Isaiah 8:7. Just to touch on 2 of those. In Isaiah 8:7, the king is the symbol of a nation, and Assyria's king is referred to as strong waters. There's a word in there in verse 8 that says overflow. That evokes a picture of water, which fits with verse 7. Then in Isaiah 17, verse 12, there's a clear connection between waters and large groups of people. But then he elaborates on the picture and gives you other words that paint a multi-sensory description. Verse 13 reinforces the wind and connects it with the reference of nations reacting to a warlike situation. And then in Jeremiah 51, he shows the same connection where he refers to his repeated displeasure towards Babylon with a direct association to destruction by people. So all throughout these texts, the connection between waters and peoples is really clear. Just as clear as the previous scriptures connect winds and war. And we talked about that once again last summer when we were talking about the two-horned beast. So we should never forget those connections and those symbols and their meanings. Question 5. What did Daniel behold as the result of strife and commotion among the nations and peoples of earth? What did he see in Daniel 7:3?
And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another.
4 beasts. So once again, beasts don't come up from the sea. So we know we're talking symbology. So we should expect that somewhere in scripture, we're going to get a code, a prophetic code to unlock the meaning of this and all other symbols that may be used. The results of all this warring between peoples or nations produced empires. Once again, this is how empires rose and fell, via conquest. Later on in the quarter, when we deal with the last 5 lessons, we're going to see a contrast between the conquest approach and another approach to acquiring an empire. Hold that into your minds as you're jotting down the answers to these questions, and you can use these answers like as a cliff notes when you refer back to this quarterly to refresh your memory. So I trust you are jotting these answers down if you do not already have them. Verse 6, or I should say question 6, what was symbolized by these 4 great beasts? Verse 17.
Kings. These great beasts before are 4 kings.
Right.
Arise out of here.
And what other word could we use? Beast could represent kings or could represent
Nations.
what?
Nation.
Right, or kingdoms. Kings or kingdoms or nations. All right. Question 7. 7:4. What was the first kingdom? Describe that first kingdom. What was the description?
It was like a lion and had eagle's wings.
That's important. A lion with eagle's wings. Once again, we know that's symbolic. Lions are not walking around with wings. So that needs to be translated. A lion with eagle's wings. Read note 2. Someone read note 2.
Inasmuch as in this vision, 4 universal kingdoms span the history from Daniel's day to the end, just as in the dream of Daniel 2. The first beast here brought to view must symbolize the same power that was represented by the head of gold in the great image, Babylon.
Okay. So you see a clear connection between Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, which is consistent with Scripture. Scripture often introduces a topic or a subject, treats it in one way, giving you a certain body of information, and then revisits the subject or the topic in other passages of Scripture and gives you a different body of information, more detail or different detail. This is God's way of expanding your understanding as he unwraps revealed information like a flower unwraps petals or stretches out petals as it responds to the rays of the sun. So this is very consistent with one of God's techniques of communicating to his people. So the first kingdom was Babylon. Why would eagle's wings be used? What is that descriptive of or illustrative of?
Speed.
What was that?
That represents speed.
Speed, correct. He's letting us know that this empire, when it makes or begins its assault to become a world empire, it moves speedily in its acquisition of territory and its conquering of peoples. Eagle's wings, swift. And we will see a contrast between that and a later empire that comes soon thereafter in Scripture. Let's see. I want to reread verse 4 again. 7:4. Someone reread that.
The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it.
Oh, okay. How many wings does an eagle have?
Two.
Two. That's important when we contrast it with another kingdom. All right. How does the lion compare, question 8, with the other beast of prey? Proverbs 30:30. What do we get from that text as it pertains to the question, how does the lion compare with other beasts of prey?
The lion is considered king of the beast.
King of the beast. So that would mean we would expect the lion to be the strongest, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Now, think about this. From a strength standpoint, how would an elephant rank with a lion? Just purely from strength. Which animal would we expect to be stronger?
Elephant.
But notice the phrase. Someone read Proverbs 30:30.
A lion which is strongest among beasts and turneth not away for any.
Okay. Notice the phrase in the question that the pioneers wrote. How does the lion compare with other beasts of prey? That's important.
Yeah.
Does anybody know what the predominant diet of an elephant is?
Grass.
Say that again.
An elephant?
Yes. What's the primary diet of an elephant?
Vegetable. Yeah, he eats
vegetarian.
Yeah.
As big as that animal is, that animal's a vegetarian. He's not a beast of prey. He doesn't go around trying to kill animals for his food, like a lion. So once again, we can see how when God uses certain things to symbolize other things, he's using elements of that symbol to make specific points about the thing he's illustrating. So when we study, we need to go a little bit under the surface and try to ask ourselves, why that animal? Or why that term? Why that symbol? Why that illustration? What about that thing is he trying to tell us? And if we do that, we will find things there that we did not expect to see. Someone read 2 Samuel 1:23. Second Samuel 1:23.
Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives and in their death. They were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions.
There's another passage of scripture that clearly connects eagles with speed, which completely backs up why the eagle's wings would be chosen to be on the lion in the vision. God knows what he's doing. He uses certain descriptions for certain reasons. And there's wisdom involved if we would dig enough into the illustrations to pull those points out. All right. How does Babylon compare with other nations? Isaiah 13:19.
MJ,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for the sake of our wider audience, could you slow down just a little bit?
Okay. I wanted to leave some room at the end for discussion.
Okay, thanks.
All right. How does Babylon compare with other nations?
And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans, excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah.
So what is this scripture trying to tell us about how Babylon compares with other nations? In your own words.
Mo said it was at the top.
Okay, be a little bit more descriptive, a little more specific. Based on what you just read in Isaiah 13:19.
Beautiful and corrupt.
Beautiful. This is a magnificent looking nation. They were splendid. The hanging gardens, the gold. This was a pretty empire, a pretty capital. They gloried in their wealth and magnificence. The richest and most visually compelling. What other characteristic of Babylon was symbolized by eagle's wings? We already talked about that. Speed. Deuteronomy 28:49 also helps to support that connection, just like 2 Samuel 1:23 did. What change did the prophet see come over this symbol? Someone read, let's see, what is it? Jeremiah 51:30. Someone read that.
The mighty men of Babylon have ceased fighting. They have remained in their strongholds. Their might has failed. They became like women. They have burned her dwelling places. The bars of her gates are broken.
All right. Just so that we don't accuse scripture of being sexist, it is obvious that back in that time period, it was men who went to war, not women. So by using that connection, women, they were simply saying, fighting ceased. Babylon got so weak, they stopped fighting, essentially. Someone read Isaiah 21. Verses 3 and 4.
Therefore are my loins filled with pain. Pains have taken hold upon me as the pangs of a woman that travaileth. I was bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. My heart panted. Fearfulness affrighted me. The night of my pleasure hath he turned into fear unto me.
So in answer to the question, what change did the prophet see come over this symbol? Distress, sadness, pain, fear. No longer that mighty, we cannot be conquered, we cannot be destroyed, we will last forever idea that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to promote during his reign. By the time Babylon met their end, they were not so strong. They were not so confident. What change in the kingdom of Babylon was thus indicated? Weakness. Ineffective in war. Okay. Question 9. Looking at verse 5. I think we're back to Daniel 7. Daniel 7:5. Someone look at that read that. Oh, let me pause right here. Let's read note 3. Someone read note 3.
The kingdom of Babylon, as noticed in this prophecy, continued less than 70 years. More than half of that time, the kingdom was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. It was during his reign that the kingdom made all of its mighty conquests. His successors, each in turn, became less bold and aggressive until the weakened Pusillanimous Belshazzar, who possessed none of the brave and noble qualities of Nebuchadnezzar.
All right.
Well, I gotta look that word up.
Pusillanimous.
It means afraid, to be afraid.
I mean, very afraid. We're talking
Okay.
knee knocking, boots knocking afraid. We're talking afraid to the point of disgust. When I looked that word up, Webster says contemptibly timid or cowardly. And then when I looked up the word contempt, it means to despise, disdain, or openly disrespect. Then when I looked up the word disdain, it said to scorn. And then when I looked at the word scorn, it said inspire anger with disgust. So when the pioneers described Belshazzar as being weak and pusillanimous, notice the decline of the kings here. In Ptolemy's canon, it tells us that Nebuchadnezzar ruled 43 years, which is more than half of the approximately 70 that Jeremiah foretold and that Daniel had read that Israel would be in captivity to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was the longest king and the strongest king of that empire. When he stepped down from the throne, the empire almost immediately got weaker and weaker and also shrunk. There's a picture actually showing the amount of territory that Babylon had at its peak. And then by the time they were conquered, they lost a significant amount of that territory as the Medes and Persians were growing.
MJ, that would explain the rationale. You know, we don't know exactly why, but I can see now how when the Bible gives the account of Belshazzar's actual people under him actually killed him. After that writing on the wall, after that big feast, that kind of helps explain, because if he was really afraid like that and contemptibly afraid, they probably only honored him based on his leadership, his position. That was it.
Mm-hmm. Did you say that you read somewhere that he was killed by his own people?
Yes, I'll have to go back and look that up, but
I'd like for you to give me that if you find that. Okay.
Pretty much.
Okay. But he definitely was slain when the Medo-Persians took over the empire. When Cyrus diverted that river and the river Euphrates to make his advance extremely easy, dried up the riverbed and walked right under the front gate of the capital and seized Babylon pretty much without a fight. And the other reason that occurred so easily was because, in spite of Belshazzar's being weak and timid and non-aggressive, which fits with the not fighting much, not trying to conquer other territories because they were so weak by then, their empire had shrunk, he has the nerve at the same time that the Medes and the Persians were making their approach to take over the capital, he's partying. And in the quarterly of last year, first quarter, which was on Daniel, the editors of that quarterly made a reference to the fact that the party got so out of hand that it turned into an orgy. So they're partying and engaging in wanton behavior at the same time that they get conquered. I mean, this is a weak king. This explains why the Babylonian Empire was so easily taken and why Nebuchadnezzar's reign was the peak of their empire. Ptolemy's canon says that he left in 561 BC, and secular historians record the very next year, 560, as the peak of that entire empire's power and size of territory. Nebuchadnezzar was their best king. Most, if not all, of the major conquests that took place in that empire were on Nebuchadnezzar's watch. No wonder he thought, nobody can take me. Because he was reveling in a history of success. He had been consistently successful, conquering, until he had developed the empire to its greatest level. He thought, nobody could take me. I haven't been successfully resisted up to now. I'm the man. Which then speaks to the whole all golden image, why he was so easily manipulated by his wise men to create the idol in the first place, because his ego was out of control. Weak and pusillanimous was Belshazzar, who possessed none of the brave and noble qualities of his grandfather. Something else he didn't do. He never learned the lessons that Nebuchadnezzar learned. Nebuchadnezzar got humbled and actually acknowledged that God is God. And that everything I have is because of him. He can set it up and he can take it down. It's not me, it's him. Belshazzar never learned a thing from Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He learned none of those lessons. He had ample opportunity. And led directly to his downfall, which is consistent with the way God looks at nations. The more spiritually dark you become, the riper you become for a takeover. And the less esteemed that nation is in God's eyes. He treats that as inferior. The more spiritually dark you become, the more inferior your kingdom, which is not the way human beings look at it. All right. Question 9, verse 5. What two kingdoms united in the conquest and overthrow of Babylon?
And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh.
So what kingdom are we talking about?
Medo-Persia.
Right. It was a joint empire combined between the Medes and the Persians. Why is a bear raised up on one side? What does that symbolize?
One was stronger than the other.
Good. That's an answer. Which one? That's another answer. Between the Medes and Persians, who was stronger?
Persia.
Persia was stronger, even though when Babylon was at its height, the Persians were actually the smaller of the two. They had the smaller amount of territory. But as Persia grew, while Babylon was getting weaker after Nebuchadnezzar left the throne, the Persians ended up absorbing the kingdom of Media. And because there were related kings, the time they took over Babylon, the Persian king allowed the Median king to co-reign, which is why it is spoken of as the Medo-Persian Empire. Kind of like, but not quite, the way the Chaldeans joined with the Babylonians to take out the Assyrians. What about the three ribs? What does that symbolize? Does anybody know what that symbolizes?
Three ribs. They represent Lydia,
It represents
Lydia, good. Somebody's
Bab-
doing some Lydia. What other two?
Babylon,
Babylon
Babylon
and Egypt. Because these were the three major chunks of land or reigning empires that needed to be taken out so that the Medo-Persian Empire could dominate all of that territory. So they had to take care of the Babylonians, they had to take care of the Lydians, and they had to take care of the Egyptians. The Babylonian Empire never quite got to take over the Lydians. So once again, as we learned in the two-horned beast, as the empires progressed and succeeded one another, the size of their territory grew. So the Medo-Persian Empire was much bigger than the Babylonian Empire at its zenith or height. So the three ribs, Babylon, Lydia, Egypt. And Lydia is kind of interesting because it's in the area of Turkey. Hold on to that because that will be revisited later on in this quarter. Question 10, verse 6. What special characteristic does the leopard possess?
4 wings and 4 heads.
What characteristic does that symbolize?
Speed.
Speed. How many wings?
4.
4. How many wings did the lion have?
2.
So what is the Bible trying to tell us between the lion with 2 and the leopard with 4?
The leopard conquered with extreme speed.
Much faster than the Babylonian Empire conquered their empire. When I look at Ptolemy's canon, guess how long the reign was for Alexander the Great? Anybody know how long?
4 years.
7, close enough. He conquered more territory than the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire in a much, much faster time. And then he died. He wasn't around long enough to solidify the empire enough to find suitable successors. He died so quick that almost as fast as he got the territory, the empire lost territory because it got broken up. What do the 4 heads symbolize?
4 kings.
4 generals.
4 generals. Okay. So this empire was broken up into 4 pieces, 4 sections. When you study this again, do some research into those sections because this is pivotal to later expositions of scripture in another chapter of Daniel that will be focused on in the last several lessons of this quarter. So put an asterisk by that and do some digging. Someone read note 6.
Go.
The two wings added to the lion fitly, representing the rapidity of the conquests of that empire under Nebuchadnezzar. Upon this leopard beast are not only wings, which are unnatural to the beast, but also an unnatural number of wings. This most fittingly represents the unparalleled rapidity and celerity of the movements of the Grecians under the reign of the intrepid Alexander the Great, who, after conquering the then known world, died at the age of 32 years.
Alexander was, if you read the history of Alexander the Great, he had such an intense warrior spirit in him that he almost died during one of his battles before he ever got back to his capital. And while wounded, it did not deter him from continuing to fight. He kept fighting and he kept fighting and he kept fighting and he kept making conquest after conquest after conquest. His own people were trying to tell him to slow down. He couldn't do it. He was so consumed with conquest. He could not get enough of war. He never lost a battle during his entire reign. He was undefeated. He was like the Rocky Marciano of war. This was Alexander, typified by the four wings. All right, or I should say question 11. Look at verse 7. What is symbolized by this fourth beast? Seven, I think. Daniel 7:7. What is symbolized by this one?
He was dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong.
Right.
Had huge iron teeth, devoured, breaking in pieces, and trampled the residue with his feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns.
Dreadful and terrible. This beast, when it conquered, was exceptionally cruel. Remember one of their methods of punishment, crucifixion. This empire was extremely cruel, extremely evil. Read verses 23 and 24, first part of 24.
Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms and shall devour the whole earth and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise.
Okay, so what empire are we talking about that succeeded the Grecian Empire?
Pagan Rome.
In Rome.
Pagan Rome.
And
now,
this would be,
oh, go ahead.
MJ, this would be during the time when Christ, at some point during the time when Christ came on earth, right?
Correct. He appeared on earth, he arrived on earth during the pagan Roman Empire. Dark time, in the cruelest of kingdoms, which fits the death that he was to die. Crucifixion. That's one of the absolute most cruel and worst ways to kill somebody. Because usually they leave their criminals to hang on the cross and rot over days. they die slowly. And then when they die, the birds then pick at them.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus giving up his own spirit shortened that, because he wanted to honor the Sabbath even in death. So it was not his lot to hang on the cross and rot like the typical crucified criminal.
Well, he would have died anyway, guys. They pushed a sword up his side to make sure he was dead before the Sabbath.
Right, but he was already dead before that happened.
Yeah.
So he voluntarily gave up his spirit, because the Bible tells us, I can pick it up, I can put it down. Just like he sets up kings and remove kings, he could lay down his life and take it back up again. And he did that on purpose before the sword went into the side. Whereas all the other criminals who get crucified, they either get their legs broken to hasten death, or they're left up there to rot. This is extremely cruel behavior. That's the pagan Roman Empire, from which the 10 kingdoms came. Now let me back up a little bit. The 4 heads of the leopard. Does anybody remember what the names of those generals were? Those heads represented generals that took over and divided the kingdom after Alexander's death.
Cambyses is one of them. Ptolemy.
Ptolemy's one. Keep going. Cassander, that's another.
Lucas.
Seleucus.
Seleucus, that's another one.
And Lysimachus.
Right, Lysimachus. Lysimachus. Those are the 4 generals. Pay attention to that, those 4 generals, and which portions of the Grecian Empire they administrated over, because that is going to weigh very nicely later on when we deal with another chapter in Daniel near the end of this quarter. So put an asterisk by these points that I'm highlighting, because they will come up and you will see how they connect, leading us to certain prophetic conclusions that can be drawn, supported by the pioneers' scholarship back in Ellen White's day. Okay, so the 4th beast is pagan Rome, followed Greece rather. Someone read note 8.
In the breaking up of the Roman dominion by the incursion of tribes from the northward, 10 kingdoms were established upon the ruins within the boundaries of the old empire.
Now, we're not going to list those all, but who named some of the tribes from the north that came down and started picking away at the pagan Roman Empire?
Germans and the Franks.
Say that again?
Germans and Frank are
give me those tribal names. There were tribal names, not the countries that they became.
Okay.
Anybody?
The Visigoths.
The Visigoths, that's one. Keep naming a few.
Heruli. Vandals.
Vandals. Keep going.
The Ostrogoths.
The Ostrogoths. Keep going.
Sueve.
Yes. Okay.
I think Franks was another name.
Yeah. Alamande. Yeah. Okay. So these are the names of the kingdoms, or the tribes rather, that came down from the north to attack the pagan Roman Empire from on top. And they started to whittle it down and whittle it down. Which portion of the pagan Roman Empire did they attack? The western portion or the eastern portion? Geography can help you out a bit.
I believe it was the Eastern.
No, it was the Western.
Western,
Because
okay.
their empire was huge. The Western half is basically right under Europe, above the Mediterranean and going west. So from the north, they're coming down from England, Scandinavia, Germany, that area of Europe coming down to attack the western half of the Roman Empire. So just in case you ever find yourselves trying to assist somebody in the understanding of these prophecies, going through this yourself with other people, these are things you can bring out, which can easily be supported by history. You can help people see how this prophecy was literally backed up by easily confirmed events that actually occurred in time. This can help you explain these things to other people. So we need to know the details that the Bible has chosen to give us. God wanted us to know, so we should know. We should want to know, and then we should put forth the effort to know and have it in our minds.
MJ, I found something very interesting about the Vandals.
Okay.
I always associated them with, as you said, coming from the north just into Rome and sacking Rome. But in history, around, I believe it was 1200s, I believe. So further along, they had been obviously persecuted when they were plucked up. I know you're going to get to that part in lesson 3.
Right.
But when they were being exterminated, some of them went down to Northern Africa.
Okay.
And they began to settle there. And what was interesting about that is that at that time, they were Sabbath keepers. I was totally shocked.
Interesting.
The tribes in that region were also Sabbath keepers. When the Roman Empire found out that, oh, the Vandals are hiding out in North Africa, we're going to go down there and annihilate them. When they went down there, they discovered that people were keeping the Sabbath. And that's when they began to persecute, exterminate. And this happened over a pretty long period of time. It wasn't just a few years, it was a long period of time, to the point where people would go into hiding and a lot of them would either convert to Islam or they would convert to Catholicism. So it was quite interesting. I didn't realize they had gone down that far to hide out.
You said the Vandals were also Sabbath keepers?
Yes, they had gone down there and they had begun to hide among the Sabbath keepers. Yes, it's quite interesting.
Oh,
so are you saying they picked up the practice from them? They didn't have that before they went?
I don't know if they had it before they went. That I don't know. But it was interesting that what drew Rome down there was, oh, we got to go down and exterminate these Vandals. They're out there. Some of them have, taken up residence in Northern Africa. Yep.
I don't recall exactly why the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and the other Heruli were against Rome, but it had, I felt, something to do with beliefs, spiritual beliefs. I can't remember exactly.
Yes, it did.
Didn't it? Okay. And Cheryl, do you remember the source of that information? The history of the Vandals and how they
I'll cite it and put it. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I'd like to see that too. I'm glad you brought that up because it further supports this controversy between good and evil, as you have pagan Rome turning into papal Rome right around the same time that the barbarian tribes from the north were encroaching upon the Roman Empire.
Right.
And then they're going down to Africa and terrorizing Sabbath keepers. So this really does create some nice connections between this ongoing controversy of Satan and Jesus, and truth versus error, and Sabbath versus Sunday, Christianity versus paganism. We can just, I mean, you can see the parallels and the tie-ins and the connections. This controversy, this battle, this war has been going on from day one, even from Adam and Eve's time.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve had two sons at one time, Cain and Abel. Abel turned out to be the good son, Cain the bad one. Abel was killed. Then Seth comes on the scene. He's another good one. And Seth spawns a group of believers, and Cain spawns a group of evil people. And then the mingling between the two, the offspring of those two, created a pollution of Christianity. And so you will, if you look spiritually speaking throughout Earth's history, you're going to see one of two things. Either mingling, bringing about compromise, or resistance, bringing about confrontation, spiritually speaking. And you can track those two all the way through history. Question 12, verse 8. Concerning what did Daniel specially desire further information? What did he want to know more about based on verse 8?
He wanted to know more about that fourth beast that's making war with the saints.
Exactly, because he couldn't understand what that was about. And remember, Daniel is coming off of, okay, I was concerned that God had changed his mind because I got a vision that I didn't understand right around the time when Babylon was about to fall to the Medo-Persians. And I remember reading the book when he talks about, I read the books or I consulted the books. He was talking about the books of Jeremiah. Prophets would read each other's books. So he read the books of Jeremiah and said, oh, God has already ordained that this captivity is only going to last about 70 years. So when it gets about the time for that 70 years to run out, he's expecting Israel to be released. So he's looking for them to come out of captivity. And then the Medes and Persians come along, and then he gets this other vision, and then he sees this fourth beast, and then he sees the 10 horns, and then he sees the little horn that rises up, and he goes like, oh, wait, oh, more, oh, wait a minute. I thought we just got out of one and we're in another, and God, will we ever be restored to national prosperity? So Daniel is quite distressed. He's extremely concerned. So he wants to know more about this fourth beast. Verses 19 and 20. So then when we go to verse 24, what information did he actually get in verse 24 in response to his request for more information in 19 and 20? What does verse 24 tell us?
The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings.
Okay, so he was given more of the code. The horns represent kingdoms that come from another kingdom. So these 10 horns became 10 kingdoms arising out of the territory that the Roman Empire had previously conquered out of that fourth beast. So he was given that information. He was also given something else. What else was he told?
There would be a little horn arise out of that 10.
And that little horn kingdom would do what?
Persecute God.
3 kings.
What was that?
Subdue 3 kings.
Subdue 3 kingdoms. There you go. That's the answer to that. The information he got from the request was he was told that the horns represented kingdoms that came out of the fourth beast. So he was given a translation of the symbol. And then he was told there was a special kingdom out of those 10 that would arise from those 10 and conquer 3 of those. So he was given more future information with some more detail and more specificity.
Are those three nations or horns that the Catholic Church conquered, rooted up? Those kingdoms, they didn't believe in the Trinity. They are called Arian kingdoms.
Correct. Arian.
Yeah, so they weren't with the Catholic Church, so the Catholic Church
That's why they
destroyed
took them
them.
out. And that's why they took them out. Because they needed to put down anybody with an opposing spiritual philosophy so they could spiritually dominate the area.
But that would be.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
When you said that they didn't agree with the Trinity, wouldn't that be the understanding that the Catholic Church has of the Trinity versus the understanding that some Protestants have of the Trinity?
They were not in agreement with the Catholic philosophy of the 3 persons of the Godhead. And specifically, when we look at the Arian philosophy, what they did believe was that Jesus was a created being. They took that father-son relationship between God the Father and God the Son as procreative, in that fathers and mothers as parents produce offspring. So before they appear or arrive in the world alive, they did not exist prior to that until such time as they were birthed, which is how people arrive on the planet. So the Arian philosophy looked at that, connected it to the father-son relationship between the Father and Jesus Christ, and said, Jesus Christ, he's created. He came from God the Father, much like human children come from their parents. That put them directly in odds with the papacy. The papacy said, they got to go. And they wiped out those kingdoms, and those kingdoms did not become any of the nations that the tribes, the other tribes, eventually became. They were wiped off the board. They disappeared. All right. Question 13. What did Daniel behold on the part of the power symbolized by this little horn? Verse 21. What did he see in verse 21 about this little horn power?
They persecuted God's people, and God's people didn't fight back.
Go ahead.
They controlled God's people, and anybody who opposed them, they persecuted them, killed them.
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons we call it the Dark Ages. Not only for the spiritual darkness, but for the awful persecution. They hunted down God's people wherever they could find them and just wiped them, killed them.
Like the Waldensians.
And the Albigenses, yeah.
Mhm.
And the Huguenots. Those are three classic groups during that period that had to flee into the mountains to get away from the persecution. They were coming hard, pursuing, much like that will happen in the time of trouble when the plagues fall. The world will be literally pursuing God's people on the planet to hunt them down like animals and kill them as soon as they find them. So it's like you almost have a type and a type situation. The Bible says nothing's new under the sun. The devil is predictable and repeatable, because he's either going to conquer by persuasion, meaning manipulation with lies, or he's just going to kill you. If you won't join, I'll beat you or I'll kill you. So this is classic devil behavior. God's people would lose their lives in conflict with that power. And remember, Daniel's having all kinds of trouble trying to understand his vision, and he's just coming out of one regime's oppression, or captivity, I should say, and into another empire's captivity. So Daniel's really bothered by this. It's like, okay, we got out of one, we're into another, and then we're going to lose our lives. So, you can see why Daniel was so distressed by the visions he was getting in chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8. So he was just begging, please, God, help me understand. Tell me, what does this mean for our people, with whom he closely identified himself, just like Moses did. Daniel was a godly man. Moses was godly. They both identified themselves with the people. If they go down, I go down. So please help me understand, what are you telling me in this vision? Question 14, how long was the oppression of this power to be felt by the saints? Verse 22. What does verse 22 tell us? How long was this oppression?
Until when the Ancient of Days came.
Keep going.
Until the end of the age.
Read verse 22, someone out loud.
Until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom.
See, those are two important. Well, go ahead. What? Was someone going to make a comment? Those two phrases are important: judgment and possession of the kingdom. So this oppression was going to be felt by the saints all the way until the oppression would not permanently end, until the saints were given judgment and possessed the kingdom. Has God's saints possessed their kingdom yet? Yes or no?
No.
No. Are we still living in an age on Earth, in Earth's history, where this progression of pagan Rome is not still making power grabs and power moves?
That beast, his wound is being healed, or probably healed by now. And
it's close.
Yeah,
it's
that
not
beast,
completely, but it's close.
yeah, it's gonna repeat all of that madness later.
Exactly. So this oppression will return and be felt by the saints. They will experience the distress of that oppressive environment. When do the saints actually have the judgment of the inhabitants of the earth? What time period would that be?
After the 1,000 years.
Anybody else?
After the judgment.
Yeah, the millennium. That's what I understand.
Right. They will get to look at the books during the millennium. That's when they will have a chance to judge, essentially. But to be more specific, it will be their time to confirm in their own minds the judgment that God has already executed. He will have already analyzed and investigated the lives of humanity and decided who's in and who's out. And then he allows the saints during the millennium, check my work. I want you to see. And that's what the Bible talks about in the New Testament, judging men and angels. That will be their opportunity to do so. So the oppressive effects and the oppressive activities and agendas of this papal power won't end until the second coming and the saints find themselves in the millennium. And then afterwards, they get to physically possess their kingdom with their Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Last question. Then what will certainly follow the kingdoms represented by these four beasts? What does verses 26 and 27 tell us? Someone read verses 26 and 27.
But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him.
Remember the stone that becomes a mountain in Daniel 2? Notice that 26 and 27 said the little horn's power would be abolished, removed, taken. So the saints get their kingdom after the stone has crushed all the other empires, including the little horn. That is yet to come. The papacy has to be completely taken out of business permanently. God has to remove all interlopers, all interference to his kingdom, so that he can then give it to the saints. And they can enjoy that kingdom with him forever. So that's coming. That's a future attraction coming. Now let's back up into verse 22, where it says, Ancient of Days. Someone reread that text and that phrase where the Ancient of Days is, that portion of Scripture.
Until the Ancient of Days came.
When did the Ancient of Days come? There's a passage. There's a passage in Daniel that talks about the Ancient of Days coming and somebody receiving their kingdom. Who am I talking about?
When Jesus receives the kingdom from the Father.
Right. When did that happen? There's an actual year.
In 44.
What was that?
Is it 1844?
Correct. And why is that important? Why then?
Because the investigative judgment began in 1844.
Correct. Because it was at the, oh, go ahead. Because it was at the end of what prophecy?
The 2300 days prophecy.
There you go. See, that's why it's important to learn these things and then connect them with other pieces of information from other passages as this picture is fleshed out. You start with a skeleton, and then you put muscles on the bones, and then you put the organs in, and then you wrap it with skin. This picture is being developed and added to and elaborated on and elaborated on. So God the Father, the Ancient of Days, Ellen White talks about that in Great Controversy. He confers the kingdom to Jesus, the Son of Man, and he is qualified to take that kingdom because he's the Son of Man, because he came in human flesh and paid the price, exhausted the penalty, as Eric would say, and qualified to be the righteous judge and to stand in the gap between the Father and humanity and plead for the lives of the redeemed. So
I got a question.
he earned the right to have that kingdom conferred to him from the Father at the beginning of the investigative judgment. Go ahead, Cliff.
This kingdom that Jesus is getting, is it a broader kingdom or just earth? Is it just earth, or is it, more other kingdoms in the world, in the universe? If you don't know, that's all right.
I was going to propose, if there are other unfallen worlds in his universe, then it would seem to encompass them. But if we are the only ones, we're the ones that needed to be saved. That's the part of his universe he needs to redeem or buy back. So I think the focus is here where the sin problem has to be worked out. So this is the portion of the kingdom that got usurped, so to speak, by the devil when sin came in. So that sin problem has to be permanently dealt with. The devil has to be permanently put out of business. And the earth needs to be renewed and restored so that that part of his kingdom can be fully reclaimed with the rest of his universe. So that's the kingdom that the Ancient of Days gave to his son, because his son came here to die and pay the price.
Did I hear you say that the Father conferred the kingdom to Jesus in 1844? And if so, what's the reference? Because I thought that kind of happened right before Jesus came back, but I haven't really actually studied that before.
Well, that's actually 724. We talked about that when we dealt with the investigative judgment last January.
I'm not sure I was in that one to look that up.
But it's like he officially conferred it. He's saying, this will be your kingdom. It's officially yours now, even though physically it is not time to take physical possession of it, because you still have an enemy to deal with. And you still have subjects to add to your kingdom, because there are people that still can be saved. You have enemies to put down. So God always dots his I's and crosses his T's. He doesn't have to do anything. So it was made official then, but the actual possession, Spirit of Prophecy confirms this, will take place once all of that has been done, and he can actually physically take back possession of his planet clean, with a clean people, his saints, the remnant, the redeemed, including the unnumbered multitude. So remember how God deals with time. He can give you something even though you can't take literal ownership at the moment, but he can say, it's yours.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. So he conferred it on Jesus. He said it's yours.
Yes.
But he doesn't actually sort of take possession of it until sometime right before he comes back. Is that what I?
Well,
and
remember, he's got to do three things. He's got to take out his chief enemy. Or he's got to do his chief enemy and all of his human enemies, which means cohorts of his chief enemy. He's got to completely take care of them. And then he's got to completely fill up the ranks of the redeemed, because he's not going to leave anybody behind. Nobody left behind. Anybody who can be saved will be saved. He will lose no one. That's the second thing he has to do. And then the third thing he has to do is clean up the planet. He's got to restore the earth. It wasn't just us that got tainted. It wasn't just animals. Nature's polluted. Everything needs to be regenerated and transformed and reborn, so to speak. So after all of that is done, then he can truly, with the saints, possess the kingdom.
I see what you're saying. I wasn't clear on the word confer. And you said you went over that in your investigative study judgment, which I think I have a copy of. I don't think I was in the class.
I believe I did send that to you.
But I can look that over. Okay, thank you.
You couldn't attend that in person. Yes.
Yeah,
it's
Brian,
like
illustrate.
I was about to try to illustrate that.
But illustration of that, MJ, is a good illustration that we live every day. Is when we buy a house, we have a mortgage. House is not technically our house until we get rid of that enemy, which is that debt, which is that mortgage.
Come on now. All right.
And then when we pay off that mortgage, we are given the title to that house, and it is officially ours.
When you buy a car.
Completely yours. Right. Not just on loan, so to speak. That there are elements of that analogy that work, but I was going to look at it from another standpoint. It's like engaging in a coronation ceremony. So when I said confer, I'm saying there's a ceremony where the father says, the son approaches the father. Father stands up and says, son, you have earned the right. You are eminently qualified. I approve. You have a kingdom. This kingdom is yours. So officially he's saying, you will have this. Physically, it's not time for him to literally come onto the planet and possess, to run the kingdom without interference. No enemies, no fires to put out, no crises to deal with. That's future. But the kingdom is his. And that's what I mean by confer. He is saying it's yours. You will have this kingdom.
It also makes me think of after David was anointed by Samuel, he knew that he was going to be king, but he wasn't actually king for quite a long time after that. He had Saul to deal with, and he had to run for his life and do all those things, but he knew that he was going to be king.
Nice analogy. There you go. I like that. That's another picture of that.
But Brian,
yeah.
On the other hand, God, Revelation 21 says God himself will be with them and be their God. So God, the Father, will be here too on earth. both he and Jesus.
Not discounting that at all. Because remember, the Godhead, they work in tandem. Everything they do as a group. They are always of one accord, always on the same page, always laboring to fulfill the same objectives, always have the same agenda. They are completely in sync with each other.
And to me, it seems like Earth will be the center of the universe, since God himself will be living here.
Mm-hmm. I think there are some Spirit of Prophecy quotes to that effect. Somewhere it seems like I've read something to that effect. All right, that concludes this lesson. Lesson number 2, the history of nations foretold. Previously studied January 9, 1904. Any questions or comments?
Did you say that Persia was always stronger than Media, even when they had a smaller territory? Or did they become stronger when they got it, when their territory grew? But I misunderstood something. I didn't hear that part real good. We're talking about the 3 ribs, bear on its side.
Note number 4, I think, can help with that. Someone read note 4.
Note 4. Here, I'll just go ahead and read it since I'm. The marginal reading of verse 5 says, raised up one dominion. Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian were associated together in the conquest and overthrow of Babylon. As an act of courtesy on the part of Cyrus, the rulership of the newly formed kingdom was given to his uncle Darius, but in a short time the Persian became the ruling element in the kingdom. Thus the dual kingdom represented by the bear is said to have exalted one branch above the other.
So based on this, it might be more accurate to say, once they joined forces and overtook the Babylonian Empire, then the Persians exerted their strength over Media.
I thought Persia overrun Media first, and then Egypt, and then Babylon. I thought that was the sequence, but I'm not sure.
Well, in my reading of the history, it did seem to me that even though Persia allowed Media to co-reign once they took over the capital of the Babylonian Empire, that they were already stronger because they had actually absorbed the land of Media on the way to conquering Lydia and Egypt. And if you look at it geographically, Persia is to the east and south. So as they absorbed that territory, they had to go north and west, and then come back down south to grab up the Holy Land and grab up Egypt. So, and looking at it from a human progressive standpoint, you have to be stronger than whoever you've just conquered right before you conquer them. So that was my thinking when I said that even though they had a small amount of territory, they were already stronger. It would seem to me that they were already developing a greater strength, which allowed them to take Media in the first place.
Okay,
So that's the reason why I made that statement.
I see. So
of course,
Media,
history might not bear that out, but that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, I figured you had studied the history, and that's what I was not sure of. It sounds like I heard you say Media actually defeated, Persia defeated Media. And that's when they became one territory. So
as they were making their progression to go at Babylon. And then over time, they expanded, grabbed up Lydia, which is in that Turkey area, and then came on down, went down by the went down by the eastern coast of Mediterranean Sea and took over the Holy Land area, and then went further south and grabbed up Egypt. So they absorbed a lot of territory.
Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
they also went further east and started to encroach on India. Their physical territory, their geographical territory was huge, much bigger than Babylon in their heyday.
Okay, that
And they
answers the
also
question.
extended up into Armenia, and they were starting to encroach on the bottom of what is the northern part of what is now known as Russia. That Georgian area, Georgia, the country of Georgia, and that area, they started encroaching up in there. They absorbed a large amount of territory.
Well, what do you think about Russia and China aligning themselves against America? Don't you think they would destroy America if they were to ally themselves and fight with nuclear weapons?
I don't know that they would, now we're just talking not in the context of prophecy here. We're just talking about from a military standpoint. When I look at America and their allies, plus the distance, and then Russia and China and who might oppose them from Europe as they're trying to encroach upon America with the traversal of seas that has to take place, going across the Pacific or the Atlantic, I'm thinking that, once the allies get into it, that might flip the scales, and Russia and China might have a bigger fight on their hands than they think. Because, almost everybody is nuclear capable at this point.
Well, Russia and China got intercontinental missiles that can reach America.
So do we. And so do a lot of other countries. So I'm just saying they might not be as big and bad as they think they are, which is typical of countries that have the imperialistic mindset. That's the reason why empires eventually implode sooner or later, because they get too big for their britches. And then they have trouble holding on to their territory, and then they get encroached upon. You said ego. Sooner or later, I don't care how big and bad you are, you're going to get got. So, but interesting to speculate on that. But based on Revelation, especially 13 and 18, we know how this is all going to play out. America is going to join hands with the papacy and help the papacy cement their global agenda. So whatever Russia and China do is not going to get in the way of what Revelation's already told us is going to go down. So we can count on that. Any other questions, comments? Last week, this week. All right. Thanks for attending. This is going to be a very nice study as we progress through this quarter. Please hang on to the last 5 segments, especially. The end of May and all of June, we will have a guest who has done an incredible amount of study on the topics that those lessons will introduce. And they're going to weigh in with a lot of pertinent, relevant, and eye-opening information. Please endeavor to be around and dial in on those weeks, because that's when the discussions are really going to get good. And we're going to uncover some stuff about portions of Daniel that have been hard to understand and to which there are multiple theories afloat. We will get to that. So all of this is basically backdrop. As you can see, the theme and the approach that the pioneers are taking is mostly prophetic. And there's a huge reason for that, because they were literally living in the time of actual fulfillment of prophecy, of Revelation's prophecies, as they applied to Daniel's prophecies. They were literally watching this stuff unfold before their very eyes. So they were extremely prophetic minded. So it would make sense that their approach to the study of this book of the Bible would be strongly prophetic and have an investigative judgment bent, because that's where their heads were, because they literally saw themselves on the brink of eternity. And Ellen White made 5 or 6 quotes to that effect. All right, Cheryl.
Did I hear you say the guest was confirmed?
Yes, we have
Okay.
spoken to the guest, and he has said he will be there to dial in. He is available.
Cool.
I'm very much looking forward to his input, because he has quite a bit to share about those last 5 lessons, 9 through 13. So please be around for those, starting with the last week of May, last Sabbath of May, and all of June. All right, Cheryl, are you there?
It's gonna be good. It's gonna, yes, I am. Yes, I am. I was just thinking about some of the comments you made, and I'm just thinking about how you were saying that they were living during the fulfillment of prophecy. Just like to add, so are we.
That's true.
Are we.
That is absolutely true.
And that's why it's, like this question of Russia and China, I hadn't noticed that in the news, so I'll have to look that up. But knowing what we do know about prophecy, I would tend to agree in my understanding with MJ that, well, they're not going to take over because, the United States is going to align with the papacy in forming an image to the beast. And then
Correct.
again, it makes me wonder, is this another distraction of the world, the Russia? It's the same thing with the European continents trying to connect all these years, and then we know it's not going to happen, and then we see the Brexit and all these different things.
And speaking of Russia, interesting that Cliff brought that up. Russia is going to be quite a bit involved in the last 5 lessons. We will see how their activities factor into the discussion of those last 5 lessons, because they were participating in fulfillment of prophecy during the pioneer's lifetime.
Yep.
All of that stuff could have happened in their time frame if the church had finished the work then. But since that did not happen, we get a long pause, fast forward 170 years, and we're here in 2021. What did not get fulfilled is going to be fulfilled, because those prophecies still hold true. Just
So
because they didn't take place then, they will take place because God put them in the word, so they have to happen. And they will happen before he comes.
So am I hear you say that this Russia-China thing or whatever could have something to do with these last 5 chapters that we're going to talk about?
Well, Russia specifically. I can't say anything about China, but Russia was absolutely